Hi, I'm Nina Melendez, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. Today, we are talking about risk. When we think of our goals for success and the things we care about, risk is always part of the equation. The world just spent an entire year assessing the risk of going into the office, to the supermarket, or meeting with friends. But it's a balance. Think about it too much and it can paralyze action. Think about it too little and you can find yourself in a precarious situation. Well, lucky for us, our next guest has spent his entire career dealing with risk, and he wrote a book about it. Joining me now is General Stan McChrystal. He is the co-founder of the McChrystal Group, an advisory team that helps improve the performance of organizations. He spent 34 years in the U.S. Army and retired as a 4-star general. He is the author of the book, Risk, A User's Guide. He got his undergrad at West Point and was a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School. Stan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nina.
So Stan, I mentioned in the intro COVID and how we have been living with risk nonstop for the past year and a half. How has COVID changed our perception of risk?
You know, it's funny. I think for some people, they think that we got blindsided by this unbeatable foe, COVID-19. That's not really true. We really dropped the ball. The reality is pandemics are predictable. You don't know exactly when it's coming in the form, but they've come through history with regularity. And second, we have really good knowledge of what to do about it. We have public health experience. And in this particular case, scientists just did an amazing job of producing vaccines faster than ever. So Nina, our conversation today ought to be self-congratulatory, how we, the United States, and we, the world, beat off this viral infestation. But we're not. In fact, we are mourning people we've lost. And the reality is, it was our inability to respond to that risk, our weakness, not the strength of COVID-19.
So it's interesting because in your book, you write that the greatest risk to risk is us. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. Think about it. We spend a lot of time worrying about external risk, what's around the corner, what's in the dark, what's over the hill, what's going to come get us. We're not very good actually at predicting when those risks are coming or those threats are emerging or exactly what they are. Instead, what we should be doing is looking in the mirror, because most of the ability, the leverage we have is in us and in our organizations. We can make ourselves risk fit. In fact, there's an analogy. If you think of the human immune system, what it does for our bodies, every moment of every day, it detects risks that are coming. It assesses whether they're dangerous, it responds and kills them if need be, and it learns. But we don't get up in the morning and worry about our human immune system. We don't say, I hope it works today. We only are really aware of it when it doesn't work, and then we're suddenly vulnerable. And yet, our organizations, even our society as a big organization, has a risk immune system. And we say it's made up of 10 risk control factors that, working together as a system, give us the resilience, give us the strength to fend off those threats that come. Never perfectly, but you don't have to get it perfect. You just have to be strong enough that you can respond well and move forward.
And I do want to talk about go deeper into the risk immune system and those 10 dimensions that you mentioned. Let's pause very quickly and say hi to some of the members joining us from all over the country, all over the world, actually. We've got Alexander from New York, Richard from California, Amir from Egypt, and Johan from South Africa. Welcome to the show. And Jeremy, you've got a fan here, Stan. Jeremy says, this is awesome, fellow veteran here. If you have any questions, I'm speaking with General Stanley McChrystal, his latest book, Risk, A User's Guide, talking about how to understand, mitigate, and analyze and effectively deal with risk. Talking about teams and organizations, Stan, how can we make ourselves respond more effectively to risk? What are some ways that teams and managers can do that?
One of the first things we don't do very well is prepare. We tend to have a crisis erupt, and then after the crisis, if we did well, we congratulate ourselves, maybe learn some lessons. If we didn't do well, we hope it doesn't happen again. But there are ways to work out, almost like exercising your body. You can exercise the various components, the ability to communicate inside your organization and do it effectively, the ability to have a good, solid narrative that people are aligned on, how we use technology, using it effectively, but understanding the other side of that double-edged sword where it can make us vulnerable. How we leverage diversity. And I'm not talking about diversity just of gender or race. I'm talking about perspectives and experience as well. And then the important part of leadership. So we can actually exercise those. We can measure those beforehand, determine how risk fit we are, and we can also exercise them. Because in reality, most crises that come are about 80% the same, meaning the things you have to do in terms of communicating and leading and leveraging your team and being willing to take action and adapting are the same. You need those same capabilities regardless of what the threat is. It's only about 20%, I would calculate, that's actually unique to whether it's a pandemic or a flood or some other challenge.
You know, something that also you mentioned in your book is you said that the response to risk is so instinctive. And if that is the case, then how do we change that? How do we change our instinctive knee-jerk reaction to risk to make it actually effective and respond well to it?
Yeah, it's a great point because sort of individually, we each have a relationship to risk. Some of us are more comfortable taking it, and organizations tend to have a personality the same way. Some organizations, when risk arrives, they sort of go into the fetal position. Other organizations may start flinging out bets, and neither are particularly responsible. I think there's several things you do. One is put in place some processes which discipline how you act. Think about when you are thinking about risk or responding to a threat that's actually arrived. Give yourself some process that will take you in a disciplined way of getting the right inputs from the right people, making a decision in the right kind of rhythm, being able to overcome the inertia that sometimes scares individuals or organizations, either from taking action at all or from changing what they're doing. And give yourself that kind of steadiness. And then risks suddenly don't seem quite so daunting. It's that disorienting moment when you're sort of going, I don't know what we're going to do, that freezes many of us into inaction.
I think what I loved in your book, you said that you went into, part of the reason you went into the military is you wanted to seem like this very, risk, that you could handle risk and you're this kind of like risky guy. And then you went into one of the most risk-adverse organizations in the world. Thinking, about our ability to take on risk, so much of that is our resilience, right? And I'm curious if you think that resilience is something that can be taught or if that's just something that's innate that we're born with.
Nina, I do think it can be taught, and maybe it can be taught through experience. People often ask me about leadership. Can it be taught or does it have to be born? And I would argue much of it can be taught. Now, everybody's going to have a personal relationship with risk, which gives you a certain proclivity to respond a certain way. But think about serial entrepreneurs, particularly ones that have failed 3 or 4 times. It reminds me of the beginning of high school football each year. You go out and you first put on the pads and you're a little nervous, then you get your clock cleaned and you realize it's not going to kill you. You get up, dust yourself off, and then that risk doesn't seem so daunting. And I think an entrepreneur who starts a company and fails, gets up again, are less scared to start again than someone who's never tried it. Even though you'd say, well, wouldn't they learn that failing is bad? Well, they also learn failing's not fatal.
So resilience can be taught. And I love to know that we can learn from our lessons and build more resilience. There's this famous Rumsfeld quote about unknown unknowns. And I'm curious if you think that businesses and organizations can respond to unknown unknowns, and if so, how?
It's a great thing. You bring that term, you say unknowns. Wait a minute, I don't know, and then I don't even know that I don't know.
You don't know that you don't know it.
It's kind of like walking through a dark forest at night. You don't know what's out there. You don't know if you'll be able to handle it. And so most people don't walk through a dark forest. And I'm not recommending that they do. But the reality is there are so many things you can't know. And if you let them scare you into inaction, then suddenly you find 1,000 reasons not to overcome the inertia, that fear. And so what I'd say is the first thing you do is make yourself as capable of responding to a range of things. If you're going to walk through the forest at night, be in pretty good shape. Do all the things that might give you a better chance. But whatever you do, don't let yourself be to the point where you're afraid to do everything because you think you don't know what's around the corner.
I have a question here actually from Stephen. He says, I read about a combat study that found that soldiers who think positively do better in combat, and that the military tries to train soldiers to think like this. This is interesting. How do you teach this? How do you teach this, Stan?
Yeah. Well,
And that
first
perhaps,
off,
so just to add on to that, that perhaps one's positive thinking can help them respond better than to risk, to have a better sense of risk. What are your thoughts?
That's exactly right. If you think about the nature of combat, or even large combat for leaders, there's always that specter. I could fail. An individual, I could get wounded, I could be killed, or I could lose the battle. And all of them are very frightening to soldiers. And they're also an excuse to do nothing. And you can go into things moving very slowly and tentatively. The thing about war is the winner isn't the person who moves tentatively. When the enemy attacks, good commanders are thinking about counterattacking just at the moment when this organization has wondered whether they can withstand the enemy's attack. And so that is a sense of optimism. Some people call it aggressiveness. I would say the idea is, if I am moving forward, if I am active, if I am doing something, I am advantaged. The other thing is, the most frightening point to be in war is just to be doing nothing. If you put a young soldier in a foxhole at night alone, they are going to be terrified, just as you or I would be, Nina, because you're there, you don't know what's going on. So when you've got them doing something, get them out of the hole, get them going after the enemy, then suddenly you have an idea that you have some control over the situation. And so that applies from the individual soldier all the way up to the largest organization.
So would you then say that action is better than inaction then?
Almost always. There are things you shouldn't do. So I'm not saying all action should be done. But if you are doing something, if you are moving, you are shaping, you are creating initiative, think in business. If you sit back and wait for what your competitor is going to do, and you're always scared about that, and you're trying to defend, you're not going to be very effective. Ulysses Grant during the Civil War has a great quote when his staff was telling him what General Lee was going to do. And he said, I'm tired of hearing about what General Lee's going to do. He's going to attack us on both flanks at once, and he's going to do a somersault over our army and come at us from the rear. He says, stop it. Let's start talking about what we're going to do to him.
I love that quote. That's so good.
It is great.
So let's go back to those dimensions of risk you mentioned earlier in the show, the 10 dimensions of risk. One thing that really caught my eye is the importance of communication. Communication was number 1 in the 10. Beat out technology, bias, even timing. Curious why you put communication at the number 1 spot for a healthy risk immune system.
Absolutely. In warfare, if you want to defeat an enemy, what you do is you take out the communication. They can't coordinate. They can't reassure each other. They lose cohesion. Think about our society. When we don't effectively communicate between each other, what happens? We lose cohesion. Now, first, there's just a question of, can you communicate? Can the information get there, and do people understand it? That's pretty straightforward, and it used to be hard. Now it's easier technologically. The problem we wrestle with now is it's so easy to communicate. We can communicate faster than we can think, and we frequently do. And we have a lot of misinformation, unintentionally corrupted information. And we have a lot of disinformation, where people, for a reason, push things that are not true. And the danger is, because we can push information so aggressively now, that disinformation can corrode our ability to understand what's happening and make good decisions, both individually and as societies. Look what happened in Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. People otherwise completely rational as a society essentially go in a direction that almost destroyed the world. And it was because that information that became so powerful was wrong.
How do we combat misinformation? Now where misinformation and information is at our fingertips at all times, how do we combat something like that?
Nita, I don't think we figured it out yet. I think we are a society and a world in which technology is further ahead of our maturity. And so It's like when we first got atomic weapons after World War II, people were afraid that we had created this technology we couldn't control. We've been tenuously lucky with that, but I would argue that information technology is out ahead of us now, and it's really become a threat to us. I think the clever answer is to say every individual should be a better consumer of information, more skeptical, more careful, and therefore misinformation and disinformation wouldn't work. But we're not there yet. And I don't know when we're going to get there. So we're going to have to figure ways to balance our very important rights of First Amendment rights to communicate with the reality that we've got people yelling fire in a crowded theater. And that's going to continue to cause us problems.
When you figure out the answer, Stan, please come on the show and let us know. You were the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. You served in the military for 34 years. I would love to just pick your brain on some of the important lessons, or maybe there's one very important lesson that you learned about risk in dealing with people and dealing with people's lives and communication and all of that. Tell me, what would you say is one of those big lessons that you learned?
Yeah. And I shouldn't have learned it because we've learned it before. And that was a relationship to the Afghan people. People want to step back and look at a war and they say it's between the good guys and the bad guys, depending upon who you think is what, and how many can you kill of them and vice versa. That's not what war is at all. War is about convincing a population which side should win and will win. And our inability to make enough progress with the government of Afghanistan or with their security forces to build confidence in the Afghan population eventually became our biggest weakness. It was the lack of confidence in Afghan people in villages, in remote valleys and whatnot, that really became the Achilles heel of it all. And we should know that because it happens in our own society at times. And we've got to think about how we do that better.
We've got more folks joining us here. Julius from Canada, Rafael from Tucson, Emma from Florida, and Oscar from Mexico. And Stan, I have a question from Orius who asks, how can leaders better recognize the skills like empathy and situational awareness? And you yourself as a leader and arguably an empathetic leader, how can other leaders get this?
Yeah, I think the first thing, if you're talking about situational awareness, recognize that across the organization, it's critical and demand it of your team members. Don't let that one team member who lets themselves get in a silo and they very narrow and they say, this is all I do, because you can't do things effectively unless you understand the context in which you're operating, because that matters so much. Empathy, of course, is the ability to see things through another person's eyes. I don't know how often we sort of get in our own world and we say, this is what I think, therefore it must be right. And if the person across the table doesn't agree with us, we talk louder. And you don't have to agree with them. But the reality is, I came to the conclusion many years ago that if my life had had a different journey, I could have ended up exactly as the person, in Afghanistan with a different background, different religion, different history than me. And I would have had their perspective. So respecting that and having the ability to say, this person sees things differently for very logical reasons, and then try to figure out from that standpoint, how do I deal with them?
Part of being in the Army is you're dealing with a lot of people who are very different from you. You're serving with people who have very different viewpoints from you. Is there a lesson there that we can learn about us as a society, and how as a society we can kind of all gather together under one goal? Yeah. I don't know, help me out. Is there a lesson?
Sure.
What do you think?
We think about those events in American history, the Revolution, Civil War, tragic, the Great Depression or World War II, times when we've done big things. We tend to step back and go, it was the challenge that made us better. I would argue it was the shared challenge that made us better. One of the problems with our society now is for a long time, people from different zip codes, with different religions, different income backgrounds, haven't interacted much. And now in our current information world, you can stay in your own little world. In the military, what we found is if you take people from across society, as you do, and you put them all in the same unit, after a while, they form into a unit and they start to have much greater empathy because who do you dislike? It's the people you don't know. It's those people on the other side of the block or with another religion, another background. But when you interact with them, you suddenly start to realize there's a lot more in common. My remedy, one of the remedies for America's challenges now, is to do national service for young Americans. A year of paid national service, not military, something civilian, where they interact with people doing something important for an extended period of time, so that later in life, as citizens, they don't see those people as them, but they go, wow, you know, I served with people, boom, boom, boom. I think it would help bridge some of the divides which challenge us right now.
I love that answer. Thank you so much. And Stan, we've had so many people, just huge fans of yours joining. Aurea says, thank you for your outstanding answers. And Nicole says, thank you so much for this advice. And Stan, on behalf of all of us, thanks for joining LinkedIn News Live. It was a real honor and pleasure having you on the show today.
Completely my honor, and thanks everybody for joining.
That was Stanley McChrystal, General Stanley McChrystal, author of the book Risk, A User's Guide. I loved it. Pick it up where you can. And thank you for everyone who commented in the post. You can continue the conversation here. You can check out some of our other news stories to the right of your feed, or if you're on mobile, you can click into the search box. And on Thursday, my colleague Caroline Fairchild is talking about speaking up against wrongdoing by your employer. She'll speak with one expert who wrote the handbook on how to be an effective whistleblower. You won't want to miss that. I'm Nina Melendez. Thanks so much for joining LinkedIn News Live.